did very well between the 1960s to 1970s. Different government policies of backward integration in agriculture provided that Korea created a value chain that provided both the seedlings. There was a program for seed multiplication. There was R&D to improve on those seeds. There was agricultural mechanization. There was infrastructure on irrigation. And you can see the challenges of topography that Korea is facing today. And with all that, they were able to actually provide for self-sufficiency in food production. And because by the 1970s, they were already quite comfortable in terms of feeding themselves, then the government policies started on development. And you could see how all the heavy industries started in the mid-1970s. Look at Hyundai Heavy Industries, Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering, Samsung Heavy Industries, Hyundai Mipo Dockyard, and almost all the small shipbuilding infrastructure in Korea started around the mid to late 70s. And today, Korea is proud to say that they're number one in shipbuilding, because Hyundai Heavy Industries is the number one shipbuilder in the world. They're also proud to say that they're number one in LNG, liquefied natural gas production, because Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering is the number one builder of LNG vessels. And Samsung Heavy Industries is number one in oil platform buildings. So this is a very deliberate policy to move from developing a third world country in 1987 to a proclamation in the last 2 years that South Korea is a first world country. This has been basically, as I mentioned, by deliberate policies, political will of government, and sincerity of purpose, and also having a disciplined society. The military program that makes every South Korean adult male to go for military service for 2 years before the age of 25 is actually a deliberate policy to get people to be disciplined, to be guided. I mean, you hardly see people cleaning streets in Korea, because you only clean it if people litter. Koreans have been taught the paradigm of not littering, being responsible. So nobody throws things on the streets, so there's no need for anybody to clean the streets. You realize that that is a deliberate policy that makes Koreans to be very conforming to government policies. And there was also a mix of both dictatorship and democracy, because under President Park, basically they achieved almost all the development infrastructure within that time. Now, talking about Nigeria, it's not as if Nigeria has been stagnated. We have our own challenges. As you know, we're the largest in population in Africa, and we're one of the top largest in the world. We're number 5 in population in the world, over 200 million people. So it's a major challenge for us to feed ourselves, but we've done pretty well. If you look at our own programs also, from Operation Feed the Nation under President Obasanjo as the head of state between 1976 and 1979, to Green Revolution under Shagari in 1984, to Better Life under Babangida, to the many import substitution programs that have been taking place over the last 23 years of democracy in Nigeria. because we moved from being an importer of rice by about 85%. Today, rice importation in the country is just about 20% of the total requirement. And in wheat production, we've done quite so much. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but we pursued a very aggressive wheat program. There's also been a lot of programs on intervention on financing, because one of the things that South Korea had in its development plan was it was able to attract foreign debt into Korea by making interest rates high. And by 1985, South Korea was the largest debtor out of the developing world. But it was able to channel these debts into building infrastructure for agriculture and also setting up very good infrastructure for industry. And the import substitution program basically led to them moving from a net importer of food to today a very efficient export-based economy with over 50 ports. Today, when you look at the maritime infrastructure of Korea, you will know that this is a very deliberate program to actually move things forward. What can Nigeria learn from the development in South Korea? The contexts are very different. We can sit down and discuss academy and all the theories, but for whatever you do, you need to be contextual. Yes, South Korea was at ground zero after the war, but South Korea was already a very well literate society by the 18th century. You see the difference? It is like somebody who knows how to build and you go and destroy for him, he'll be able to rebuild. Unfortunately for us in Africa, until 1960, we basically had nothing. In 1960, when we had independence, we had less than 10% literacy and numeracy among the people. And if you can't read or write, it is difficult for you to be able to do anything. We all came from our last two generations, basically by 95%, we're all from extreme poverty. And some of us here, most of us here are second generation educated people coming from Nigeria, or third generation at most. South Koreans have had literacy and numeracy over the last 500 years. They've had sciences, they've had arts, they've had architecture, they've had engineering, they've had everything. We basically had nothing. So when people make comparisons between Korea and Nigeria, and they try to take some African countries and say that our GDP per capita in the 1960s were the same or even better, it is a non-contextual comparison at all. We had nothing. We were trying to just grow up, to have education, to learn to read and write, to learn to develop. We had no infrastructure, we had nothing. We were just peasant farmers as at that time. So it's not as if we've not made strides. To have come from those challenges today, to be able to be on the map of the world and competing or even being part of the conversation in many fora around the world, it means that we have done quite well. I'm not making excuses for our failures in so many other things. We could have done a lot better, but because we are basically too eager to see this development, we compare ourselves to America, we compare ourselves to Europe, we compare ourselves to China, we compare ourselves to India, and now, most recently, we tend to compare ourselves to Korea. Korea is a homogeneous society, as you all know. They all speak one language, They all have one culture, they all have one food. So before you make those comparisons, please go back to context. We are 220 million people. We speak 500 different languages. Each of these ethnicities of the 500 have their own different food, they have their own different culture. In many cases, they have their own different clothes. If I ask everybody here to stand up and identify himself, by the name, I'll tell you, most of them don't speak each other's language. Most of them don't share each other's culture. So we're a melting point. We have the challenge of managing our diversity, but we're also a beautiful country with all the challenges to have been able to manage that unity. When you look at Korea being the same homogeneous society between North and South, the same people are not able to live together. We're 500 and something ethnicities, and with all the challenges of having independence in about 60 years and not having literacy and numeracy, to be able to be where we are and talking where we're talking today, I think we have done quite well, even though I believe we could do a lot better. Thank you very much. I would like to limit it to this so that we can have an interactive session. Thank you.
How we can use this ethnic diversity for our development? That is the one query. And next question is, we all are development workers and working in any ministry and any office or government offices, and we are facing one common challenge in the developing country, that is the corruption. And we have only three ways, that is to work with this corrupt system and fulfill the need of the system, that is corruption, and fulfill our needs. Other is to maintain our integrity. We have to just escape from the system, but we all know that we cannot escape this corruption. We have to fight against the corruption and to maintain our objectives of the development. So how can you maintain our integrity and just achieve our objective working with this corrupt system? So I want your view in these two areas.
We don't have a common language. So if you don't go to school, you cannot even communicate with each other. Our only common language is for English. And I told you by 1960, we had less than 10% of the people that could speak English. That is why we were able to create our own pidgin English so that we could communicate with each other. Anyway, so to tackle your two questions of how do we harness our diversity? Yes, the only way to harness diversity is through education. Education, education, education. When you build the human capacity and the human resource through education, you will change the paradigm of ethnicity. You will be able to see yourself as a human being. Because first of all, before anything, if you put babies from India, from Nigeria, from Korea, from America, put them inside a room and let them grow up together, they will have no ethnicity. Because nobody was born an ethnic human being. We were all born as human beings, and that's all we are. We all carry the same anatomy, we all carry the same DNA in us as human beings. So it is actually societies that make us become ethnic groups. So the only way to basically harness that diversity is to develop our human capacity, to change our paradigm, to understand that most of all, we are human beings before we're anything. And that way, I think we'll be able to have a convergence in our development program. The second thing you mentioned is the issue of corruption. Corruption is basically, yes, it is a major issue for the developing world. But why is it a major issue for the developing world? It is the lack of institutions, of compliance, basically. Wherever you go to in the world, human beings are the same. 2 former Korean presidents are in jail. The chairman of Samsung, the biggest corporation in Korea, is in jail. It's all out of corruption. When you go to the US, I mean, the greatest companies in the US have come down. So many former leaders are in jail. Same in Europe. It is out of corruption. So corruption is not only in the developing world, it is everywhere in the world, because the inherent thing in the creation of human beings, it is in our body DNA that we're indisciplined and we're selfish. And we only conform to 2 things, fear or favor. And until those institutions of compliance that will make us responsible to whatever we do are there, corruption will always be there. And I can tell you, in my country, for instance, yes, we're known for corruption, but we're making great strides in corruption. Because today we have senators in jail, we have governors in jail, we have former presidents being called to answer questions which could never happen before. Today in Nigeria, even when you want to be corrupt, even when you want to steal public money, you have to plan it. Because you have to plan on how not to be caught. Because at the end of the day, there is a chance that you may be caught. But these institutions take generations to build. They don't happen over time. Today in Nigeria, we have the EFCC, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. For 200 million people, people are basically so eager to see the effects of these institutions reach everywhere. It takes time to build these institutions. For you to police 200 million people, we also have challenges of income. Nigerians generally, especially the Nigerian elite, I think we have a very wrong understanding of economics, because Nigerians see themselves as being a rich country. Unfortunately, we are not. We are an oil economy, yes, but what is our oil economy? Over the last 20 years, 40 years, go and do your checks. We're basically a $50 billion economy from oil. That's all we generate from oil. South Korea today is at $33,000 per capita. We're still at less than $3,000 per capita. So we're actually a very poor country, but we see ourselves because we're so many, so we're educated, but even that is contestable. How many people are educated? When you go to the diaspora, you'll find out that many Nigerians have PhDs. Look at all of you here, PhD students, master's students. We have the biggest, the highest number of graduates. But when you put it per capita, as compared to our 220 million people, what percentage is that? So I think we need to be realistic in that issue of corruption. So when you set up these institutions need money. They need money. And because we have not even grown the institution of contribution to governance, because in most developing world, we tend to think that government is only the president and the ministers. Government is all of us. If you ask your Korean colleagues here, how much do they contribute to governance? First of all, by the discipline that they have of not doing what is wrong. That is a big contribution. Then ask them the taxes that they pay. What is our tax penetration in the developing world? Very poor. In my country, for instance, I can assure you we have less than 20% tax penetration. So when people are not contributing to the purse of governance, and even that 20% tax contribution, you will find out that what rate are people paying. I remember, for those of you that must have read what Kemi Adeosun, the then Minister of Finance, mentioned when she addressed the tax issues in Nigeria at that time. It was appalling. People that pay above 100 million, which is just what, $200,000 in tax, at that time were less than 100. And how many Nigerians do you think are supposed to pay that amount? So institutions take time to build. I'm not running away from your question, but I'm just trying to build all around it. It takes a lot of time. It's generations that build institutions. It's not over a lifetime. But in the case of Nigeria, I can talk about, I know we're so much in a hurry. Nigerian elite were so much in a hurry to see development, because Nigerian elite are very exposed. We're very well traveled. We're very well schooled all over. You go to the US, Europe, Asia, everywhere you go, you see us because of our number. And we attach so much importance to academic certificates. And we attach so much pride in learning. So I just want to address the issue of corruption as being a universal thing. So it takes time. When you build these institutions of compliance, then you will fight corruption. You know, even God, the gods that we worship, in His very infinite wisdom, gave us two reasons. So, which is fear or favor. People worship God because they want to be righteous, because God has promised heaven as an everlasting life. And also He has promised hell as a consequence of not being righteous. So you see everybody trying to go to heaven. In our selfish nature, we want to die and live an everlasting life in heaven. And that is why we worship God. It's not because we fear God. It's because God has promised us something. So it still comes back to our selfishness of compliance. So thank you very much. Next, please.
However, with my experience, especially in my country, we are very good at making policies, and the challenge is at implementation. With your experience, I know you are a leader. Could you help us share with us what we can do, especially when we get back to our country, as far as policy implementation is concerned, or with the lessons learned from Korea? Because it's a bit hard with the leadership we have in our countries. Yeah, you've discussed that education is very important, and we are taking, all of us, we are taking on education as a major factor to develop our countries. However, we've seen a lot of people who are educated. After education, even the professionals, the doctors, especially in African countries, you see them moving, migrating to developed countries to go and take on jobs which are not in line with their professionals. You find a doctor is cleaner in US, in England, living alone in his country to suffer. So, as an experienced leader, what can we do to encourage our professionals who are running away from their countries to go and do some other jobs which are not helping? What can we do? Which policies can we take up to encourage them to come back? Because there is that problem of leadership in developing countries that make people to move away, to run away from their countries. Thank you very much.
Yes. Again, I go back to what I mentioned earlier. the issue of development institutions. Policy in itself is only a statement. You have to have the institution that will implement the policy. And like I mentioned, in Africa, especially as part of the developing world, because we are just coming from ground zero to learn and develop those institutions. Asia, on the other side, has had a longer time. Even the developing countries of Asia have had development over the last 200 years, and at least they read and write. And they also had administrative systems that captured everybody. In most of Africa today, you can hardly differentiate at the border region who's a Ugandan and who's a Kenyan, or who's a Ugandan or who is a Sudanese. So first of all, capturing data to know, and it's the same thing we have in Nigeria. When you go down southeast, south, you will not differentiate a Cameroonian to a Nigerian, because it was just an imaginary borderline that was created that is not marked. You will hardly differentiate up north a Niger man and a Nigerian, or up west between a Togolese, a Beninois, and a Nigerian, because we share imaginary borderlines, and we were one people until 1960. Around the border areas, we shared the same farms, we shared the same heritage, we intermarry, we have cousins and everywhere. So first of all, establishing that database of who is a citizen of that African nation, it will take time. It's institutions. Today in most of Africa, how many births do we have in the hospital? Let's be realistic. How many births do we have in the hospital? We still have in rural areas people giving births at home, and there's no registry of those births. And it is the reality. So when you're in academic discussions like this, you have to work with data and reality. And especially to the Nigerian elite, I said, recently, about 5 years ago, a BVN exercise was done using biometric data to find out who have bank accounts. And we ended up having, BVN is a bank verification number. So it actually links your biometric data to your bank account. So even if you have 10 accounts, they will all be linked up together. And we ended up knowing that only 35 million Nigerians had account numbers. So that tells you what is our financial penetration. Somebody that does not have a bank account is not within the ladder of development, basically. So it just tells you the story. How do we implement policies again, Mr. Solomon? It is we have to educate the people to make them understand on their own that they have a responsibility to be part of this governance. What we have today is that everybody else pushes governance to the president, the ministers, the directors, the governors, the commissioners, the chairman. Those are government. And everybody else is not government. But when you look at it, what is the percentage of these public offices to the general population? Today in Nigeria, the whole government in Nigeria, from the federal to the state to the local, don't employ 5 million people. So out of 200 million people, that is just about 2% are government workers. So how can only those people be government? Until we realize that all of us are government, we will not get to that level. So I think, Solomon, in a nutshell, policy implementation is about educating people, changing their paradigm, building institutions of compliance that will see to those policies. South Korea built that policy by saying after the war that every Korean out of college before the age of 25, between 18 and 25, must go for 2 years for a military training. What does this military training do? It builds civic responsibilities into people. It makes Koreans respect policy. It makes Koreans feel part of government. Have you ever noticed when the national anthem is playing in Korea? Watch everybody, every Korean. His head is on the flag of Korea. His hands are here or here, and he's like this on that flag until the anthem is over. What happens in most countries? What does the national anthem mean to you? As national anthem is playing, people are conversing, or people are moving around. Because we have lost that civic responsibility of citizenship and the responsibility of citizenship. So we need to build institutions. It will take time. It might not be in our generation, but don't get discouraged. We're getting somewhere. If all of you here, I don't think there's anybody that's less than 30 years old, so at least you can compare your country, what it was 20 years ago and what it is today, in terms of infrastructural development, institutional development in institutions of compliance, and also policies on import substitution and other developmental indices. Thank you very much. Next.
Mr. Casey.
I hope you enjoy this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm waiting for mine.
Okay.
I have something for you that you put either in the office of the dean or office of student affairs.
Okay.
Just to remember Nigeria. Just bringing it.
Okay. So meanwhile, would you please give him a big round, please?
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. You got me at a very busy time. I couldn't put up anything. I would have loved to have put something on slides so that you can use it. But I think he has, Lekon has a soft copy of what I talked about, mostly put together. Thank you very much. Is Lekon, is he coming?
He said he.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
think
It's coming.
okay, it's
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah, they put the gift
They give
his
it in the dean's office.
Yes.
All right.
Actually, I'm pretty much impressed by two things. One is you got the point exactly. The other one is insight. Wow. This is the first time to get another approach. How foreign people look upon our military policy. So you got another interpretation with it. Insight. Ooh, pretty much impressed.
It is actually, it is for me, it is the main thing that makes Korea what it is today. Because the military policy creates a convergence. It creates a sense of national civic responsibility. It creates discipline and it creates convergence. We had something similar in Nigeria from 1970. We have the NYSC. All of them here have gone through the National Youth Service Corps. What the National Youth Service Corps used to be in our time, you go to camp, you spend 3 months in camp, basically doing the military exercise. And what it does is that, so if you're from the south, you're sent to the north. If you're from the east, you're sent to the west. So it gives you a feeling of the other part of the country, just to create diversity. We also had the unity schools in Nigeria. some of us are basically products of the unity schools. So they take you from this end of the country, you go to school in another end of the country, and you're in a boarding house for 5 years. So you get to meet everybody from Nigeria. It builds that diversity and understanding of who you are and what you are. And then with the National Youth Service Corps, you go in as an adult after university at the age of 21, 22. You go, you spend 1 year elsewhere. You're teaching in a local rural primary school or secondary school. It creates that. But today, another issue that I have not talked is that the governance program is, we're not ripe for this popular democracy that we're practicing today. It has been dumped on the developing world that we must do it. Even for people to think and choose for themselves, they need to be educated. Korea did not start with democracy. When President Park was president, everybody was forced through the Semal Udon. Everybody created a paradigm of community self-help development. Today, we're thrown out of the street and we say popular democracy. You allow people who have no conscience of even who they are and what they do, the reason to make a choice, and they are compromised by their needs. Somebody who's hungry cannot think. So when you give them money, they go and elect whoever. And today, we are at that point that we have leadership that does not reflect basically the strength of the people. And because of that, today, what it has created also is that people are being used by their local leaders. We are in a situation today in my country where somebody grows up, he goes to primary school in his locality, secondary school in his locality, university in his locality. So he doesn't know anything else. So if you take somebody that comes from the north, extreme north, and you go to extreme south, even though they're from the same country, they don't speak the same language, they don't eat the same food, they don't wear the same clothes. So when you bring them here today, let me do a roll call. What's your name?
Valentina.
Huh?
Valentina.
No, your Nigerian name. Valentina.
I'm from Ghana.
Okay. Dede, all right. So you see, what's your name?
Abdullahi.
Abdullahi.
Yeah.
So, you?
I'm from Rwanda.
Rwanda, okay. Another Nigerian? Abiodun. So Abiodun and Abdullahi don't speak the same language. They don't have the same culture. And you?
Sa'adatu.
Sa'adatu, okay.
Ernest.
Huh?
Ernest Azuma.
Azuma. So Azuma and Abiodun and Abdullahi, the three of them don't speak the same language. If you ask Azuma to eat tuwo and miyan kuka, he cannot. If you ask Abdullahi to eat fufu and say ukazi, he cannot eat it. If you ask him to eat amala and ewedu, he cannot eat it. So it just shows you, but for some of us that grew up under the good system, from about age 11 or 12 when we went to secondary school, we mixed, it was a melting point with everybody from everywhere, and we had civic studies when we were in primary school. All these systems have been changed. So today the success of Korea, I'm telling you, number one success in my own opinion is this military program. It teaches Koreans civic responsibility, it teaches Koreans discipline, it teaches Koreans convergence. Thank you very much. So, this is, outside the extractive industry that Nigeria has been known for, or Africa has been known for, because every Western or developed country that goes to Africa goes for the extractive industry. It is either for our oil, for our gas, for our gold, for our nickel. But Africa has other things. We have the creative industry. We have artists. We have music industry. We have the film industry. And we have tourism centers. This is just butterfly wings. This is tapestry of butterfly wings. So the person is using gum and putting these butterfly wings to create this beautiful young lady with African hair traces. So this is for KNU to always remember Nigeria, and you can see it in green, white, green.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we must present again. Okay, then, yeah, let's go outside. Please.